before the so-called scramble for Africa. Indeed, before the scramble for territory in China. Mid-Victorian Britain was already established as Europe's leading imperial power. Yet when Britain was put on display at the Great Exhibition of 1851, a very different story was being told. Unlike at previous national exhibitions, half of the space within the Crystal Palace was given over to other countries, and their industrial and technological achievements were displayed alongside those of Britain. Partly this was to demonstrate Britain's evident superiority in the field, but also to show that all peoples of the world could become as prosperous if they followed her examples of peace and free trade. The 1851 exhibition was not first and foremost an imperial celebration. One has to wait until well over half a century later, to the Wembley exhibition of 1924, to find an event that would fit that description. The colonies of course did figure though, and there were colonial sections that implicitly underlined the economic value of the empire, a message somewhat at odds with the overarching theme of pacifist internationalism. Yet when the exhibition came to an end, and the Crystal Palace was relocated to a permanent site in 1854, the Indian and colonial exhibits were not transferred, and the empire disappeared.
One of the challenges for the historian of the 19th century who wants to understand the place and importance of the empire in Britain's private and public life is never just to look at the empire in isolation, but also always to look at the empire in its wider context.
If you read the newspapers of the time at all levels, that's from the Times down to, let's say, Reynolds' newspaper, not down in a qualitative way, but so far as the orders of society that they were directed at, you find that most attention is given to domestic affairs, in working class papers to murders and things like that, and then to politics. The second most common subject of interest was European affairs, especially when very exciting things were going on in the continent in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Thirdly, in America, which was always very popular source of news for people in the 19th century, and only very lastly from the colonies. And it was only when there was a great crisis in one of the colonies, and the Indian Mutiny was one of these, that imperial affairs came onto the front page, or the equivalent of the front page, because very often 19th century newspapers you had advertisements on the front page. But anyway, I found, looking at local papers in Hull, and it was usually local papers that people bought, that even when the mutiny was at its height, it usually came only about third or fourth in the order of priorities of news items, tucked away in the bottom of the first page or whatever.
It's often said that the Cambridge historian Sir John Seeley once claimed that the British had conquered and peopled half the world in a fit of absence of mind. Rather than trying to explain how it had been acquired, the point he was actually trying to make was that despite their country ruling over vast swathes of the globe, the wider population appeared largely indifferent to this great phenomenon. While we were doing it, he wrote, we did not allow it to affect our imaginations or in any degree to change our ways of thinking. Nor have we ceased to think of ourselves as simply a race inhabiting an island off the northern coast of the continent of Europe. Seeley's main complaint, though, was that historians too had failed to comprehend this tremendous expansion of geopolitical power. They remained fixated with parliamentary wrangling and agitations about liberty, and were thus unable to understand that the history of Britain was being written elsewhere. whilst we might question Seeley's analysis of wider society, there is little doubt that the history books of the time echo the story being told about Britain at the Great Exhibition. Empire might appear, but only at the margins.
The main themes in them, or theme, was the evolution of freedom in Britain. Britain's progress to domestic freedom, as putting her above other nations, but there's no other kind of imperial implication to it than that. That was the main thing that was taught to Britain, knowingly or not, which was supposed to be built into their sense of national identity, that they were a free people. And pride in the empire hardly appears at all. It is amazing how little there is about the empire. There could just be a few phrases about how Britain is bringing, the gospel to benighted Africans or something like that. Or there could be downright criticism of Britain's crimes in the past in stealing land from the Native Americans, for example, in North America. So it could go either way. It didn't seem to matter very much before about 1870s, 1880s.
Back home in Britain, policymakers and statesmen were often much more concerned with the European balance of power than with anything else. It's often been said that there was nothing like a debate on India to empty the House of Commons. Most voters, still a minority of even adult men at this time, were concerned about domestic issues, bread and butter issues, economic and social questions. For the great majority, the empire remained a very remote thing in the mid-19th century. Working class memoirs reveal lives of long hours, sparse leisure time, and a lack of access to the printed word. Not only was the empire far away, it often wasn't particularly relevant in lives lived by the passing of the seasons or the factory whistle. At a time when Britain was undergoing a period of tremendous economic growth and transformation at home, many people's horizons were very much fixed on finding their own way in their own world. Education for the great bulk of the population still remained extremely limited. Its value for all classes had been all but universally accepted by the 1840s. But there was almost equal agreement among the leaders of society that its primary function was to fit recipients for their proper station in life. When a royal commission examined schooling for the children of the labouring classes in 1858, it did so on the understanding that it should be cheap, efficient, and not normally take children beyond the age of 11.
The working classes did no history at all, full stop. There was none. So there was no imperial history. And there was virtually any geography, and any geography there was generally just measuring up their own schoolyard. It wasn't thought to be a good thing for children that were just going to be seamstresses and farm workers and so on to know anything beyond their own village. If they did, they might become unsettled and discontented.
The ordinary working man or woman might have been aware of the empire, or a particular part of it, through the opportunities it provided their branch of industry, perhaps through friends and family who had emigrated, or maybe through missionaries, generating support for their cause back home in the churches and chapels. But such awareness was not necessarily accompanied either by detailed knowledge of, or particular enthusiasm for empire. And for much of the century, this situation didn't seem to particularly trouble those at the heart of the British state.
Intense popular interest at home in the affairs of empire might well be disconcerting, destabilising for government and for the rulers of empire. Increased interest might mean unwelcome curiosity about the seamier side of what was going on in far-flung colonies. Increased interest or knowledge might mean increased criticism. Indeed, increasingly as time went by, it seemed as though it did. Keeping a kind of insulation between the affairs of empire and the tides of public opinion at home was valuable and clearly often explicitly desired, at least some of the time,